The bargain had been a simple one, a human life to ensure a generation of peace. It was a premise that sounded like the opening of a fairy tale, but Ilara knew the truth of such stories. They were not about princesses finding their princes, they were about the sharp, brutal edges of power, the cost of survival paid in flesh. And she was the currency. The air in the throne room of the Obsidian Palace was colder than any winter she had ever known, a profound, ancient cold that seemed to emanate from the very stones. It clung to the bare skin of her arms and settled deep in her lungs, a physical weight of dread. Black marble floors, polished to a merciless sheen, reflected the skeletal branches of the chandeliers overhead, each one dripping with crystals that looked like frozen tears. The assembled court stood in absolute silence, a gallery of beautiful, predatory statues. Their stillness was the most terrifying thing about them, the stillness of a hunting cat just before the pounce. Their eyes, 100 pairs of luminous, hungry jewels, followed her as she was led forward, the soft soles of her slippers making no sound. At the far end of the hall, upon a throne carved from a single piece of volcanic glass, sat the vampire king. Caitian. He was nothing like the monsters from her childhood stories. There were no claws, no bestial features. His was a terrible, perfect beauty, an artist's rendering of masculine grace honed over centuries to an unnerving edge. His black hair fell over his brow, framing a face of pale, aristocratic plains. But it was his eyes that held the room, the kingdom, the very world, in their thrall. They were the color of twilight, a deep, bruised purple that held no warmth, only the vast, lonely emptiness of eternity. He watched her approach with an expression of profound boredom, as if she were a mildly interesting curiosity, a new bauble to be examined and quickly discarded. Her escort, a vampire with a face like a blade, stopped her 10 paces from the dais. He gave her a small, sharp push between the shoulder blades, a silent command. This was as far as she was meant to go. The silence stretched, thin and sharp. Ilara kept her gaze fixed on the space just to the left of the throne, a trick her father had taught her for facing down intimidating lords. Never let them own your gaze. But the weight of the king's stare was a physical pressure against her skin. You are the offering from the sunken kingdoms, Caitian said. His voice was not a shout, but a low, resonant murmur that filled the cavernous hall without effort. It was a voice accustomed to absolute obedience, a voice that had never known the need to be raised. Ilara of House Valerus. It was not a question. He was merely stating a fact, cataloguing a new possession. Ilara inclined her head, a shallow, precise movement. Your Majesty. A flicker of something, not quite amusement, but a faint stirring of interest, passed through his twilight eyes. He unlaced his long-fingered hands from the arm of his throne and leaned forward slightly. The movement was fluid, impossibly graceful, and it sent a fresh wave of cold dread through her. We are told you are of high birth. That your blood is, notable he let the word hang in the air, a decadent promise. That your kingdom believes this gift will appease us. My people hope for peace, Your Majesty, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Peace, he mused, the word tasting like ash on his tongue. He looked away from her then, his gaze softening as it fell upon the figure who stood beside the throne. Ilara had not truly noticed her until this moment, had been so consumed by the terrifying gravity of the king. The woman was a spectre of impossible beauty, even among the vampires. Her hair was the color of spun moonlight, her skin like alabaster, and her eyes were the pale, chilling blue of a winter sky. She wore a gown of silver silk that clung to her slender frame, and a circlet of diamonds rested on her brow. She looked at Ilara with an expression of open, placid disdain, the way one might look at an insect. Isolde, the king murmured, and his voice, which had been so cold and vast, was suddenly filled with a raw, aching tenderness that was somehow more frightening than his indifference. He extended a hand to the woman, and she placed her own in it, her fingers resting delicately against his. Do you find their offering acceptable? The woman, Isolde, let her pale eyes drift over Ilara, a slow, contemptuous appraisal from head to toe. She is plain, Isolde said, her voice a high, musical chime that grated on the nerves. And she stands too tall. She has the bearing of someone who imagines herself important. The court remained silent, but Ilara could feel a shift in the atmosphere, a collective intake of breath. This was not just an introduction. This was a performance. Caitian's gaze returned to Alara, the brief warmth extinguished, his eyes once again twin voids. The boredom was gone, replaced by a focused, deliberate cruelty. He rose from his throne in a single, silent motion. He was taller than she had realized, a towering pillar of darkness and power. He descended the 2 steps of the dais, each step echoing in the profound silence. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could see the faint, intricate silver threads in the black silk of his tunic. She could smell the scent that clung to him, not of blood, as she had expected, but of cold stone, of ancient dust, and something else, something like winter ozone, the smell of the air after a lightning strike. She forced herself not to flinch, to hold her ground, to remember her father's words. "You are in the court of eternal night, little human," Caitian said, his voice a low whisper meant only for her, yet it carried to every corner of the room. "Here, your titles mean nothing. Your breeding means nothing. Your imagined importance is dust. You are here for one reason, and one reason only, to serve." He paused, letting the words sink into her. His gaze was heavy, hypnotic. "And your service begins now," he gestured with one elegant hand towards the woman on the dais. "This is the Lady Isolde, the true queen of this court. The sun to which all our worlds turn. And you," he said, his voice dropping further, becoming hard as iron, "will learn your place beneath her." He did not touch her. He did not need to. The force of his will was a physical blow. "Kneel," he commanded. The word struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. It was simple, absolute. A command that expected no hesitation. Her every instinct screamed in rebellion. She was Alara of House Valerus, daughter of a duke, raised to bend her knee to no one but her own sovereign. Her pride, the only armor she had left, stiffened her spine. The faces of the court swam before her, a sea of pale, expectant predators. She saw the faint, cruel smile on Isolde's perfect lips. She saw the unwavering, implacable demand in Caitian's eyes. Her breath hitched. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. For a heartbeat, for one insane, suicidal moment, she considered refusing. She considered standing tall and meeting his gaze and letting him strike her down. It would be a quick end, a clean end. Better than this slow, grinding humiliation. But then she thought of the peace treaty. She thought of her family, of the thousands of lives that rested on this single, fragile pact. Her life was the seal on that document. Her obedience was the price. A defiant death was a luxury she could not afford. Slowly, deliberately, as if moving through water, Alara lowered herself. The fine fabric of her traveling gown whispered against the floor. The cold of the marble seeped through the cloth, a chilling shock against her knees. The act was a violation, a shearing away of self. With every inch she descended, she felt a piece of her identity being stripped away. Daughter. Noblewoman. Person. She came to rest on the polished stone, her head bowed. The perspective of the room shifted. She was now looking at the gleaming tips of Caitian's boots, at the hem of his fine trousers. She could feel the collective gaze of the court pressing down on her like a physical weight. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of her own blood rushing in her ears. "Look at her," Caitian said, his voice now holding a note of dark satisfaction. He was speaking to Isolde, presenting Alara like a trophy, a slaughtered beast laid at her feet. "Look at your new handmaiden. Your new pet." Alara lifted her head. Not in defiance, but with a cold, clear purpose forming in the ruins of her pride. She did not look at the king. She bypassed him entirely. Her gaze traveled up, past the fine silver silk of Isolde's gown, past the slender column of her throat, to her face. She met the woman's pale, triumphant eyes. And in that moment, as she knelt in the most profound humiliation of her life, Alara made a silent vow. She saw the insecurity flickering behind Isolde's disdain, the desperate need for this validation. She saw the raw, obsessive grief that drove the king to such casual cruelty. She saw the brittle foundation upon which their power was built. They thought they had broken her. They were wrong. They had merely shown her the battlefield. She would learn its terrain. She would learn its rules. And she would not just survive. She would rise. The cold from the marble floor was no longer just a chill, it was a promise, seeping into her bones, forging something new and hard and unbreakable within her. The kneeling was not an end. It was the beginning. The escort's hand on her arm was rough, pulling her back to her feet. The abrupt movement made her stumble, but she caught her balance, her spine straightening instinctively. The throne room and its silent occupants seemed to recede as she was led away, pulled through a side door she hadn't noticed before. The heavy oak door closed behind her with a soft, final thud, shutting out the oppressive grandeur and the weight of 100 vampire stares. The corridor beyond was narrow, carved from the same dark stone, lit by sconces that burned with a low, smokeless blue flame. The air here was just as cold, but it was a neutral cold, free of the charged malice of the throne room. Her new quarters were a cage gilded in breathtaking splendor. The rooms were a suite, larger than her entire family's wing back home. A fire crackled in a vast, hooded fireplace, its flames doing little to warm the cavernous space. The furniture was dark, heavy wood, intricately carved with scenes of hunts and forgotten battles. A bed stood on a raised platform, shrouded in curtains of deep crimson velvet so thick they swallowed the light. Tapestries depicting nocturnal landscapes, forests under a full moon, jagged mountains piercing a starry sky covered the stone walls. It was magnificent, and it was utterly soulless. It was a beautiful, elaborate prison cell. The escort, a grim-faced vampire named Awel, deposited her in the center of the main chamber. "These are your rooms," he stated, his voice flat. "You will be brought food and water. You will not leave without permission." He turned to go. "Wait," Ilara said, the single word costing her more effort than she would have liked. Awel paused, turning his head just enough to fix one silver eye on her. He did not seem annoyed, merely indifferent. "What is my function?" she asked, choosing the word carefully. The king said, "A handmaiden." A flicker of something that might have been pity, or perhaps just contempt, crossed Awel's severe features. "The Lady Isolde has no need of a handmaiden," he said. "She has a dozen of her own kind who have served her for centuries. You are not a handmaiden. You are a symbol. You are a reminder." "A reminder of what?" "That the king can have anything he wants," Awel said, and with that, he was gone, the door closing with the same heavy finality as before. A lock clicked into place on the outside. Alone. The silence descended again, but this was a different kind. It was the silence of solitude, not of audience. Ilara stood motionless for a long time, listening to the crackle of the fire and the frantic beating of her own heart. The velvet curtains, the cold stone, the silent tapestries, they all seemed to press in on her. The humiliation of the throne room washed over her again, a hot, sickening wave. She felt an urge to scream, to smash the delicate porcelain pitcher on a nearby table, to tear at the suffocatingly fine clothes she wore. But she did none of those things. The cold clarity that had found her on the throne room floor was still there, a hard, bright point of light in the chaos of her emotions. Rage was a fire that consumed itself. Grief was a sea that drowned you. What she needed now was ice. She walked to the large, arched window at the far end of the room. It was made not of glass, but of thinly sliced, translucent agate, whirled with patterns of grey and white. It offered no view, only a milky, diffused light that hinted at a world outside she could not see. She pressed her forehead against its cold surface. The chill was a welcome anchor, a symbol, a reminder. Awel's words echoed in her mind. Not a handmaiden. Not a pet. Something more abstract, and perhaps more cruel. She was a living testament to Caitian's power and his devotion to Isolde. Her presence was a constant, public performance of his love for another. Every breath she took in this palace was for them. She pushed away from the window and began to move. She explored the rooms with a methodical focus, her earlier numbness giving way to a sharp, analytical curiosity. She ran her hands over the carved furniture, the woven tapestries, the cold stone of the walls. This was her world now. She needed to understand it. In the adjoining room, she found a bathing chamber with a sunken tub of polished granite, and beyond that, a small antechamber lined with empty wardrobes. It was in the main chamber, tucked away on a shelf beside the fireplace, that she found her first treasure. It was a book. Just one. It was bound in dark, cracked leather with no title on the spine. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the worn cover. It felt ancient. She opened it. The pages were thick, yellowed parchment, covered in a neat, elegant script. It was a history. Not of the kingdom, or of great wars, but of the palace itself. A topography of the obsidian seat, the title page read. She sank into a high-backed chair near the fire, the heavy book in her lap. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as she began to read. The text was dense, academic, detailing the construction of the palace wing by wing, the quarrying of the volcanic stone, the enchantments woven into its foundations to protect it from the sun. It was dry, factual, and to Alara, it was a lifeline. It was a map. It described secret passages, forgotten halls, the labyrinthine servant corridors that formed the palace's hidden circulatory system. It spoke of the Great Library, a repository of knowledge collected over millennia, and noted its location in the Western Spire. As she read, the palace transformed in her mind from an opulent prison into a complex system, a puzzle to be solved. Knowledge. Her father had always said it was the one weapon no one could take from you. Here, in a world where she was physically powerless, it was the only weapon that mattered. Hours passed. A silent, gliding servant brought a tray with bread, cheese, and a goblet of water, placing it on a table without a word and disappearing just as quietly. Alara ate mechanically, her eyes never leaving the pages. She was no longer just Alara of House Valerus, the humiliated offering. She was a scholar. A strategist. She was learning the layout of her cage, not to escape it, but to master it. The kneeling had been an act of subjugation, designed to strip her of her identity. But as she sat in the firelight, tracing the palace's secret veins with her finger, she realized they had failed. They had taken her name, her freedom, her pride. But in the ashes, something new was taking root. They had made her kneel, forced her to look at the world from a lower vantage point. And from down there, on the cold, hard floor, she had seen the cracks in the foundation of their throne. She would not forget what she had seen. And she would use it. The ice was setting in her veins, not the cold of fear, but the cold of purpose. Her rise would not be swift or fiery. It would be a slow, quiet, inexorable crawl from the darkness, and it had already begun. The days that followed bled into one another, each marked only by the silent delivery of her meals and the slow turning of the pages in her book. Alara became a creature of shadow and firelight, her world shrinking to the confines of her suite and the vast, intricate universe contained within the leather-bound history. She committed the palace's layout to memory, tracing the paths of forgotten corridors in her mind, her fingers ghosting over the tapestries as if she could feel the cold stone of the hidden doorways behind them. She was a prisoner, yes, but she was an informed one. The palace was no longer just a cage, it was a complex organism, and she was learning its anatomy. After a week of this monastic solitude, the lock on her door clicked open at an unfamiliar time. Alara looked up from her book, her heart giving a sudden, sharp jolt. It was not the silent food bringer. It was Ryll. "The king requires your presence," he said, his voice as devoid of inflection as ever. "In the library." The library. The word sent a tremor of something like excitement through her. The place she had only read about, the heart of the palace's knowledge. She stood, smoothing down the simple wool dress she had been given, and followed him without a word. The journey through the palace was a revelation. Ryll led her through corridors she now recognized from the book's descriptions, the Hall of Echoes, with its vaulted ceiling that carried whispers from one end to the other, the sunken gallery, lined with empty pedestals where statues had once stood before being destroyed in some forgotten war. The vampires they passed ignored her completely, their gaze sliding past her as if she were a piece of furniture being moved. She was beneath their notice, and she cultivated that invisibility, keeping her eyes downcast, her posture unassuming. It was a form of armor. The entrance to the great library was a set of towering bronze doors etched with constellations. Ryll pushed them open, and Alara stopped on the threshold, her breath catching in her throat. The room, the series of rooms, for it was a vast, sprawling complex, was the most magnificent thing she had ever seen. Shelves carved from a pale, petrified wood soared upwards for hundreds of feet, disappearing into the shadowy gloom of the vaulted ceilings. Ladders on brass rails lined the walls, and spiral staircases connected multiple levels. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and dust, a scent that was more comforting to her than any perfume. It was a cathedral dedicated to knowledge. Cation was standing near a large celestial globe in the center of the main rotunda, his back to her. He was dressed in simple black, without the formal regalia he'd worn in the throne room. He did not turn as she entered. Awilel gave her a subtle nudge forward before retreating and closing the great doors behind her, leaving her alone with the king. The silence was thick with unspoken things. Ilara stood her ground, waiting. "I am told you requested books," Cation said finally, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the sheer volume of paper surrounding them. He still hadn't turned around. "No, Your Majesty," Ilara replied, her own voice sounding small in the vast space. "I did not." He turned then, his movements slow, deliberate. His twilight eyes scanned her, a flicker of surprise in their depths. "There was a history of this palace in your rooms. You have been reading it?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "Why?" The question was sharp, direct. Ilara chose her words with care. "I thought it would be prudent to understand my surroundings." A faint smile touched his lips, a cold, humorless thing. A practical prisoner. How novel. He gestured to the shelves that surrounded them, a sweeping, proprietary motion. "This is the largest collection of recorded knowledge in the known world. The histories of empires that have crumbled to dust. The songs of people long extinct. The private philosophies of forgotten gods." He paused, his gaze intense. "And you chose to read an architectural survey. A fortress is best understood by its blueprints, Your Majesty," she said quietly. His smile vanished. He studied her for a long moment, his head tilted slightly. He was seeing her, she realized with a jolt, truly seeing her for the first time since her arrival. He was not looking at a symbol or an offering. He was looking at the person who stood before him. "You are not what I expected," he said, the words a quiet admission. "The reports spoke of a duke's daughter. Pampered. Pious. I expected tears. I expected hysterics. I expected you to be broken by now. Perhaps your methods are less effective than you believe," she dared, the words leaving her lips before she could stop them. The air grew dangerously still. The surprise in his eyes hardened into something colder, more familiar. He took a step toward her, and another, closing the distance between them until he was standing just an arm's length away. The sheer force of his presence was suffocating. "Do not mistake my curiosity for tolerance, human," he whispered, the sound a silken threat. "You are alive because I allow it. You draw breath because I have not yet decided to take it. Your pride, your clever words, they are meaningless." Ilara held his gaze, her heart hammering but her expression calm. She had nothing to lose. "Then why bring me here, Your Majesty? Why ask me what I have been reading? If I am so meaningless, why speak to me at all?" He stared at her, and for a fleeting second, she saw a crack in his ancient composure. She saw a flicker of something. Not anger. Not cruelty. Something that looked almost like loneliness, a vast and terrible emptiness in the depths of his eyes. It was there and gone in an instant, so fast she might have imagined it. He turned away from her abruptly, running a hand over the smooth surface of the celestial globe. "The Lady Isolde finds your presence in the palace grating. She does not wish to see you." The words were a dismissal, but the context was all wrong. He hadn't brought her to this cathedral of knowledge just to tell her to stay in her room. This was a test. A new move in a game she was only just beginning to understand. "I will, of course, remain wherever I am commanded," Ilara said, her tone perfectly neutral. "You will remain here," he said, gesturing again to the library. "It seems a waste to leave a scholar to stare at an agate window. You may read whatever you wish. As long as you remain here, out of sight." Out of her sight. It was a banishment and a gift, all at once. He was exiling her to the very heart of the palace's power. He was giving her access to the greatest weapon she could have asked for. Why? To keep Isolde happy? Or was there another reason? Was he intrigued, despite himself? Did some part of him want to see what she would do with this opportunity? "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said, and for the first time, the words were not just a formality. They were sincere. He gave a short, sharp nod, his back still to her. "Do not make me regret this," he said. And then he was gone, melting into the shadows between the towering shelves, leaving Alara standing alone in the center of a universe of books. She looked around at the endless rows of spines, at the ladders that reached toward the heavens. She was still a prisoner, but the dimensions of her cage had just expanded exponentially. He thought he was hiding her away. He had no idea he had just handed her the key. Alara did not waste a moment. Her exile in the library was a strategic retreat, a chance to arm herself in silence. She began not with magic or forbidden lore, but with history. For 3 weeks, she did little more than read, eat, and sleep on a cot in a small archivist's office tucked behind a shelf of astronomical charts. She consumed the histories of the vampire clans, their bloodlines, their ancient feuds and fragile alliances. She learned that Caitian was not the first king, but the 7th, and that his ascension had been bloody, a coup that had deposed a decadent and unstable monarch. He had brought order, but it was an order forged in violence and maintained by fear. Most importantly, she read about Isolde. The official histories, the ones displayed on the open shelves, painted her as a saint, a poet, a strategist of unparalleled brilliance from a noble but now extinct bloodline. She had been Caitian's closest advisor, his partner in the coup, the architect of the new order. The texts spoke of her love for art, her patronage of vampire artisans, her diplomatic prowess. And then, the story always ended the same way, a tragic, heroic death. 2 centuries ago, during the Feral Wars, she had sacrificed herself to seal a rift that would have unleashed hordes of devolved, mindless vampires upon the kingdom. Her name was legend. Her loss was the foundational tragedy of Caitian's reign. But Alara was a scholar. She knew that official histories were monuments, polished and impressive, but often hiding a messier truth. She began to dig deeper, seeking out the peripheral texts, the shipping manifests from the era, the fiscal accounts of the court, the private journals of minor courtiers. She spent days cross-referencing dates, names, and locations. And she began to find inconsistencies. Small things, at first. A record of a tapestry commissioned by Isolde dated 2 weeks after her supposed death. A courtier's journal entry complaining about Isolde's temper, describing her as brittle and vain, a stark contrast to the saintly figure of the official chronicles. The most jarring discovery came from a logbook of the palace guard. It was a dry, tedious record of patrol shifts and gate duties. Buried in an entry from the week of Isolde's heroic sacrifice was a note. Lady Isolde confined to her quarters by King's decree. High-level containment ward placed on the summer wing. Confined. Not preparing for a heroic battle. Ilara's blood ran cold. The official story was that Isolde had ridden out to the rift at the head of an army. But this record, this mundane, forgotten logbook, said she was a prisoner in her own rooms. Ilara's search became more frantic, more focused. She hunted for any mention of the summer wing in the weeks that followed. She found nothing. It was as if the entire wing of the palace had ceased to exist in the records. One night, guided by a half-remembered passage in the architectural survey, she found a hidden alcove behind a loose shelf of geological treatises. Inside was a small, locked chest. It was old, the iron bands rusted. It took her an hour of patient work with a letter opener and a piece of wire to pick the simple lock. Inside was a single, slim volume bound in faded blue velvet. It was a diary. The script was elegant, feminine, but agitated, the lines slanting angrily across the page. The first entry was dated from the week of the fetal wars. "He has locked me in," it began. "Caitian. My love, my jailer. He speaks of a rift, of a great danger, but he is the danger. He found the letters. He knows about Lucian. He called me a traitor, said my heart was divided, that I had shamed him. He looks at me with such coldness now. The love is gone. There is only a possessive, wounded pride. He says he is doing this to protect me. He is a liar. He is doing this to punish me. Ilara's hands trembled as she read. This was Isolde's voice. Not the saint from the histories, but a real woman, scared, defiant, and in love with someone else. She read on, her horror growing with every page. Cation, consumed by jealousy, had fabricated the threat of the rift as an excuse to isolate her, to cut her off from her lover, a rival lord named Lucian. The heroic sacrifice was a lie constructed to cover a crime of passion. The last entry was brief, terrifying. He is coming. He says he has found a solution. A way for us to be together forever, with no rivals to divide us. He speaks of an old magic, a stasis ritual. He says I will sleep, and when I wake, the world that hurt us will be gone. I see the truth in his eyes. This is not a sleep. It is a tomb. He means to preserve me like a flower pressed in a book, a beautiful, dead thing to be owned forever. Oh, Lucian, my love, he will never let me go. The entry ended there, the ink trailing off in a desperate, jagged line. Ilara closed the diary, her heart pounding. The truth was so much uglier, so much more pathetic than the grand tragedy of the official story. Cation hadn't lost his great love to a noble sacrifice. He had murdered her. He had entombed her out of possessive rage and then built a myth around her memory, chaining himself and his entire kingdom to a lie for 200 years. And the woman now walking the halls of the palace, the woman wearing Isolde's name? Who was she? The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The return was a fabrication, just as the death had been. Cation, lost in his centuries-old obsession, had found someone, a distant descendant, a magically altered nobody, to play the part of his long-lost love. He had resurrected a ghost, not for his kingdom, but for himself. He was performing his love for a woman who was not there, a woman he himself had destroyed. Ilara leaned back in her chair, the silence of the library pressing in. She looked at the diary in her hands. This was not just knowledge. This was a weapon of unimaginable power. It could dismantle a king, shatter a myth, and bring the entire court of eternal night to its knees. Her gaze drifted to the library doors. She thought of the woman who called herself Isolde, her placid disdain, her insecurity. She was a fraud, a puppet in a deranged psychodrama. She thought of Cation, the grieving king, the romantic tyrant. He was a murderer and a liar, trapped in a prison of his own making. And Ilara, the meaningless human offering, was the only one who knew the truth. The power of it was terrifying. It was exhilarating. She felt a profound shift within herself. The fear she had lived with since her arrival was gone, burned away by the cold fire of this revelation. She was no longer a pawn in their game. She was about to become a player. Her rise was no longer a distant hope. It was an imminent threat. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would not be the one to be broken. The knowledge burned in Ilara's hands, a dangerous weight. 4 days, she did nothing, simply sitting with the terrible truth, letting it settle. To reveal it would be to detonate a bomb in the heart of the court. The fallout would be unpredictable, violent. Cation's power was absolute, but it rested on the foundation of his tragic mythos. To expose him as a murderer and a fool would create a power vacuum, and nature, especially vampire nature, abhorred a vacuum. She needed more than the truth, she needed an ally. Her mind sifted through the names and faces she had gleaned from her reading and her brief, silent walks through the palace. She needed someone with influence, someone respected, but someone who had also been disenfranchised by the return of the false Isolde. Someone loyal to the stability of the crown, not just the man who currently wore it. The name that emerged was Lorien. General Lorien was Cation's oldest living commander, a veteran of the coup that had put Cation on the throne. The histories painted him as a pragmatist, a brilliant strategist who valued order above all else. He had been Cation's most trusted advisor for centuries. But since the reappearance of Isolde, his influence had waned. The new queen had her own circle, and Lorien, with his blunt honesty and lack of patience for courtly theatrics, had been pushed to the periphery. He was a pillar of the old guard, now holding up a roof that was being redesigned without his consent. He was the perfect candidate. The problem was reaching him. He would not come to the library, and she could not leave. She needed a messenger. Her mind turned to the silent servants who brought her food. They were humans, mostly, or fledgling vampires not yet integrated into the court's hierarchy. They were invisible, their faces blank masks of servitude. One, however, was different. A young woman named Seraphine, who sometimes let her eyes linger on the books with a flicker of longing. Once, Ilara had looked up and met her gaze, and the girl had not immediately looked away. There was intelligence there, and a weariness that went beyond simple labor. The next time Seraphine brought her meal, Ilara was ready. As the girl set the tray down, Ilara spoke, her voice low. "You admire the books." Seraphine froze, her eyes wide with fear. I do not know what you mean, my lady." "There is no need for fear," Ilara said gently. "I was a scholar before I was this. I recognize a kindred spirit." "What is your name?" "Seraphine," the girl whispered, glancing nervously toward the door. "Seraphine," Ilara repeated. "I need your help." "Not for me." "For the good of this court," she paused, letting the words sink in. "General Lorien. Do you know of him?" Seraphine nodded, her expression wary. "I need to get a message to him. A message that cannot be traced back to me, or to you. Can you do that?" The fear in the young woman's eyes was warring with a spark of something else, curiosity, perhaps even a desperate hope for change. She lived under the thumb of this stagnant court. She saw the waste, the cruelty, the obsession that was poisoning it from the top down. "Why?" Seraphine asked, her voice barely audible. "Why him?" "Because he believes in order," Ilara said. "And the current order is built on a lie that is beginning to fracture. It will collapse. When it does, there will be chaos, and people like you will be the first to suffer. I want to prevent that." It was a gamble, trusting this stranger. But Ilara's instincts told her it was the right one. She saw her own past self in Seraphine, trapped, intelligent, and looking for a way to fight back. Seraphine was silent for a long minute. Finally, she gave a single, sharp nod. "What is the message?" Ilara had prepared it carefully. She took a slip of parchment and wrote a single sentence, a quote not from Isolde's diary, but from one of General Lorien's own tactical manuals, a book she had found in the military history section. It was a phrase about the structural weaknesses of fortresses built on unstable ground. Beneath it, she drew a small, simple diagram, the floor plan of the summer wing. "Give him this," Ilara said, folding the parchment. "Say nothing. Just place it in his hand when no one is looking. He will understand." The weight was agonizing. 2 days passed. Ilara's focus was shattered. She couldn't read, couldn't think. She paced the length of the library, the silence amplifying her anxiety. Had Seraphine been caught? Had Lorien dismissed the message, or worse, taken it straight to Cation? On the evening of the 3rd day, the library doors opened. It was not a servant. It was Lorien himself. He was an imposing figure, even for a vampire. Old, but not frail. His face was a roadmap of ancient battles, crisscrossed with fine scars. His eyes were a pale, piercing grey, the color of a winter storm. He dismissed the guards at the door with a curt gesture and strode into the rotunda, his boots making sharp, authoritative clicks on the marble floor. He stopped before her, the small piece of parchment held between 2 fingers. "This is a dangerous game you are playing, human," he said, his voice a low gravel. "The game was dangerous long before I joined it," Ilara replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I am merely trying to learn the rules before the board is overturned." Lorien studied her, his expression unreadable. "You quote my work and show me a map of a place that has been sealed for 200 years. Explain yourself. And choose your words wisely. My patience is not as infinite as my king's grief." Ilara took a deep breath. She did not show him the diary. That was her ace, not to be played yet. Instead, she presented him with the facts she had uncovered from the public records, the inconsistencies, the conflicting dates, the guard's logbook. She laid it all out for him, a cold, logical progression of evidence. She spoke of structural weaknesses, of instability, of the potential for catastrophic collapse. She used his language, the language of strategy and logistics. "The official narrative of Isolde's death is a fabrication," she concluded. And if the story of her death is a lie, it stands to reason that the story of her return is as well. Lorien listened in absolute silence, his stormy eyes never leaving her face. When she had finished, he walked over to the celestial globe, much as Cation had done, and ran a hand over its polished surface. "I was there," he said quietly. "I was there the night she died. I saw the king's grief. It was monumental. It remade him. It remade this court. We have spent 2 centuries honoring a ghost." He turned back to her, his face grim. "And now, you claim he has invited a stranger to wear her skin and sit at his side." "He has," Elara said. "And her presence weakens him. It makes him unpredictable. It alienates his most loyal soldiers and advisors. It makes the crown vulnerable." She was appealing to his sense of duty, his loyalty to the institution of the monarchy that he had helped build. Lorien was silent for a long time. The only sound was the distant, whisper-soft rustle of pages turning in some unseen corner of the vast library, as if the ghosts of scholars were listening in. "What you suggest is treason," he said finally. "No," Elara corrected him. "Ignoring a threat to the stability of the kingdom is treason. I am a foreigner and a captive. I have no stake in your politics. But I would rather live in a kingdom ruled by order than one that tears itself apart over a madman's fantasy." Her words were bold, bordering on suicidal, but she knew she had to show him she was not afraid. She had to be his equal in this, or he would never trust her. A slow, grim smile touched Lorien's lips. It was the first expression she had seen on his face that was not a scowl. "You have the heart of a soldier, Elara of House Valerus. A foolishly brave one, but a soldier nonetheless." He tucked the parchment into his tunic. "I will look into this. I will use my own resources to verify your claims. But if you are right," he let the sentence hang in the air, the unspoken threat and promise of it echoing in the silence. "If you are right, then the king is compromised. And a compromised king cannot be allowed to rule." He turned and strode out of the library, his footsteps once again ringing with authority. The bronze doors boomed shut behind him. Elara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her knees suddenly weak. She had done it. She had forged an alliance. She was no longer alone. The weight of the truth was now shared, and in sharing it, its power had multiplied. The first crack had appeared in the foundation of Cation's throne, and she and Lorien were poised to strike the next blow. With Lorien's discreet inquiries validating her own, the next step became terrifyingly clear. The false Isolde was the linchpin of Cation's delusion. As long as she played her part, the king would remain lost in his fantasy, and the court would continue its slow decay. The puppet had to be removed from the stage. But a public accusation was too risky. It would give the woman a platform to deny, to play the martyr, and it would force Cation to defend her, entrenching him deeper in his lie. The confrontation had to be private, precise, a surgical strike to the heart of the deception. Elara orchestrated it through Seraphine, who had become her willing eyes and ears beyond the library walls. She learned of the false Isolde's routines, her habits. The woman was fond of walking in the palace's glass-roofed menagerie after the sun had set, a place filled with exotic, nocturnal plants that bloomed only in moonlight. It was always quiet there, her attendants dismissed so she could enjoy the illusion of solitude. It was the perfect location. Elara requested a simple, hooded cloak from Seraphine. Under the guise of retrieving a rare botanical text from the menagerie's small attached study, she left the library for the first time in weeks without a guard. The architectural survey had shown her a service corridor that would take her there unseen. Moving through the cold, dark passage was nerve-wracking. The walls felt close, the air thick with the dust of ages. She was breaking the king's command, and if she were caught, there would be no more second chances. The menagerie was a world of breathless, humid beauty. Moonlight streamed through the vast glass ceiling, illuminating strange, pale flowers that unfurled their petals like grasping hands. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and heavy perfume. And there, standing before a cascade of ghost orchids, was the woman who called herself Isolde. She was even more beautiful up close, her perfection so absolute it was unsettling. She turned as Elara approached, her pale blue eyes narrowing. "What is this? Who let you out of your cage, little scholar?" Her voice was laced with the same casual cruelty as before, but Ilara could detect a faint tremor of anxiety beneath it. She was not used to being approached, to having her private time invaded. "My name is Ilara," she said, her own voice calm and even. She pushed back the hood of her cloak. "I came to speak with you. About the poet, Isolde of the House of Nyx." The woman's expression tightened. "I am Isolde. What is it you wish to speak about?" "Her poetry," Ilara said, taking a step closer. "I have been reading it. It's magnificent. Especially her early work, the sonnets she wrote during her time in the summer court, before she ever met Cation." Ilara paused, her eyes locked on the woman's face. "Do you remember them? The ones about the sea?" A flicker of panic in the pale eyes. "It was a long time ago. One's memory fades." "Does it?" Ilara pressed gently. "Because the Isolde I have read about had a perfect memory. She could recite the entire legal codex of the Old Kingdom from start to finish. Her mind was her greatest weapon." Ilara took another step. They were only a few feet apart now, surrounded by the silent, watching flowers. "She wrote a poem about a specific type of shell she found on the black sand beaches near her childhood home. The Nautilina spiralis. She said its perfect, mathematical grace was proof that beauty was a form of logic." Ilara let the silence stretch. The woman before her was a blank canvas. There was no recognition, no flicker of a shared memory. There was only growing fear. "I don't know what you're talking about," the false Isolde whispered, her voice losing its musical quality, becoming thin and reedy. "You're trying to confuse me. Am I?" Ilara's voice was soft, almost sympathetic. "Or are you playing a part you were never taught the lines for? He gave you the grand speeches, the public history. But he forgot the details, didn't he? He forgot the woman who existed before him. He only gave you the parts of her that belonged to him." The woman's composure finally shattered. The mask of regal disdain dissolved, revealing a face that was young, terrified, and hopelessly out of its depth. "Who are you?" she breathed, taking a step back. "I am the person who knows you are not Isolde of Nyx," Ilara said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I know that she loved a man named Lucian. I know that Cation did not lose her to a heroic sacrifice, but locked her away in a fit of jealousy. And I know that he murdered her, preserving her in a stasis tomb because he could not bear for her to belong to anyone else, even in death." Each word was a hammer blow. The false Isolde stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. She had clearly not been told the whole truth. She was a pawn who had never been allowed to see the whole board. "He told me she was lost," the woman stammered. "That she was in an accident, that he had saved her, healed her. He said I had her face, her bloodline, that I could give him back what he had lost." "He lied," Ilara said simply. "He is using you to comfort himself. You are a ghost, a walking effigy. And this court, which has been stagnant for 2 centuries under the weight of his grief, is beginning to break under the strain of this new lie. It will not hold. And when it collapses, he will not protect you. He will discard you like the broken toy you are." Tears welled in the woman's eyes, tracing clean paths through the carefully applied powder on her cheeks. The mythical beauty had vanished, replaced by a desperate, frightened girl. "What do you want from me?" This was the crucial moment. Ilara could have been vengeful. She could have savored this victory. But looking at the terrified woman, she felt only a profound sense of pity. This was another of Cation's victims. "I am offering you a choice," Ilara said. "One that the real Isolde never had. You can stay. You can wait for the truth to come out, and it will. General Lorien and his allies are already moving. When they expose you, Cation will sacrifice you to save himself. Or, you can leave. Leave." The woman looked around the menagerie, at the opulent palace that had been her gilded cage. "Go where? I have nothing. I am nothing." "You are alive," Ilara said firmly. "That is more than the woman you are pretending to be. I can help you. General Lorien's influence extends beyond the borders of this kingdom. We can arrange for you to have passage, a new name, gold. A life. A real one. Your own." The offer hung in the humid air between them. Freedom. An escape from the suffocating role she was forced to play. The terror in the woman's eyes slowly gave way to a dawning, desperate hope. "Why?" she asked, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Why would you help me? After how I treated you?" "Because my war is not with you," Elara said, and she meant it. "It is with the man who believes he has the right to use people as objects. It is with the idea that one person's pain can be allowed to poison the world." She held out a hand, not in aggression, but in offering. "You are not Isolde. It's time you remembered who you are." The woman looked at Elara's outstretched hand, then at her own trembling fingers. For a long moment, she stood frozen. Then, with a choked sob, she took it. The contact was brief, but it was a pact. The game was over. The puppet had just cut her own strings. Elara had not only unraveled the myth, she had freed its unwilling centerpiece. The path to the king was now clear. The false Isolde vanished like a morning mist. One day she was the radiant center of the court, the next, her chambers were empty, her attendants bewildered. Lorien's network had been ruthlessly efficient, spiriting her away in the dead of night with a new identity and a future of her own. Her disappearance left a vacuum, a sudden, ringing silence in the heart of the palace. The court whispered. Rumors flew like bats in the twilight that she had fled, that she had been abducted by rivals, that she had simply dissolved, a phantom returning to the ether. Cation was a storm. For 3 days, the palace trembled with his silent, contained rage. He did not shout, did not break things. His fury was a cold, pressurizing force that made the ancient stones seem to groan. Guards were questioned, attendants interrogated. His gaze swept over the court, and for the first time in centuries, the vampires felt a sliver of genuine fear for their king, and of him. He was unraveling. His carefully constructed fantasy had been stolen from him, and he was hunting for the thief. On the 3rd night, he came for Elara. The bronze doors of the library were thrown open with such force that they slammed against the walls, the boom echoing through the cavernous space. Cation stood on the threshold, a figure of pure, undiluted menace. His twilight eyes were no longer empty, they were burning with a cold, purple fire. The air around him crackled with power. Elara had been waiting. She stood from the simple wooden table where she had been reading, Isolde's real diary resting closed before her. She was not afraid. The icy purpose that had been forged in her on the day she knelt was now a solid core of steel within her. She had chosen the battlefield, and he had come to it, just as she knew he would. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice a low, deadly growl that vibrated in her bones. He strode toward her, his long coat swirling around him like a thundercloud. "She is gone," Elara said, her voice steady. "Do not play games with me, human." He stopped a few feet from her, his rage a palpable heat in the cool air. "I have tolerated your presence. I have allowed you access to my knowledge. I have shown you a mercy you did not deserve. And you repay me with this. You turned her against me. You poisoned her mind." The woman who left here was not Isolde, Elara stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. "You know that. You have always known that." He flinched, a bare flicker of his eyes, but it was enough. It was a confession. "She was mine," he roared, the sound finally breaking free, a raw agony tearing through the library's sacred silence. The power that erupted from him was immense, a physical wave that sent loose pages fluttering from tables and made the candles in the sconces gutter wildly. "She was the image of my love. A balm for a wound that has not healed in 200 years. And you insignificant, fleeting creature, you took her from me. You took her from yourself, Cation," Elara said, her voice cutting through his rage. She placed a hand on the velvet-bound diary. "Just as you took the real Isolde." His eyes fell to the book. Recognition dawned, followed by a wave of pure horror. The rage in his face was eclipsed by a dreadful, bone-deep dread. He looked as if he were seeing a ghost. "Where did you get that?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "It was hidden. Like the truth. Like your crime." Elara did not need to raise her voice. Her quiet words were more devastating than his shout. "I know what you did. I know you didn't lose her to a war. You lost her to your own pride. She loved another, and you could not bear it. So you entombed her. You turned a living, breathing woman into a monument for your own selfish grief. You didn't mourn a hero, Cation. You built a shrine to your own possessiveness. He stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and agony. He looked from the diary to her face, the foundations of his world crumbling around him. He had been the grieving king for so long, the romantic, tragic figure. He had wrapped himself in the nobility of his pain. And now this small human, this offering he had planned to discard, was holding up a mirror, and the face reflected in it was not a king, but a monster. A pathetic, lonely monster. You know nothing, he snarled, but the words had no force. They were the last defense of a man who had none left. I know everything, Elara said, and her voice was filled with a strange, aching pity. I know you have spent 2 centuries forcing your entire kingdom to worship at the altar of a lie. You have let your people stagnate, let your court decay, all while you tended to a ghost. You didn't resurrect Isolde. You desecrated her memory. The woman you brought here was just another victim, another life sacrificed to your obsession. He took a staggering step back, his hand coming up as if to ward off her words as physical blows. The power that had crackled around him dissipated, leaving him looking smaller, older, and impossibly tired. The fire in his eyes died, leaving only the vast, empty twilight. She was all I had, he whispered, the sound broken. It was the confession of a boy, not a king. You had a kingdom, Elara countered, her voice softening slightly. You had a people who looked to you for leadership, for a future. And you gave them nothing but a past that was never real. You knelt before a memory, and you forced your entire world to kneel with you. The parallel was not lost on him. His gaze fell, and he seemed to see, for the first time, the scene in the throne room from her perspective. The humiliation, the cruelty, the pointless exercise of power to soothe his own wounded ego. He saw her on her knees, and he finally understood. He sank to his knees. It was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, deliberate descent, as if the weight of 200 years of lies was finally too much to bear. The king of the eternal night, the master of the obsidian palace, knelt on the floor of his own library, not before a throne or an altar, but before a human woman and the truth she held in her hands. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. The great storm had broken, leaving only the wreckage. Elara looked down at the kneeling king. There was no triumph in her, only a profound, weary sadness. This was not the victory she had imagined. It was something quieter, more complex. She had not come to break him, but to make him see. And now, in the ruins of his fantasy, perhaps something new could be built. The reckoning was complete. The reign of the Ghost Queen was over. Now, the difficult work of living could begin. The king's surrender was not a public spectacle. It was a quiet, shattering moment witnessed only by Elara and the silent, watching books. For a long time, Cation remained on his knees, a broken monarch in the heart of his own forgotten power. When he finally rose, he looked like a man who had aged 1,000 years in a single night. The arrogant cruelty was gone, scoured away by the brutal truth. What remained was a hollowed-out grief, real and raw, for the woman he had murdered and the lie he had lived. In the days that followed, the court held its breath, waiting for a purge, an execution, a bloody resolution. None came. Instead, a new and unsettling quiet descended upon the obsidian palace. The king retreated into seclusion, not the dramatic, brooding isolation of before, but the quiet solitude of a man truly in mourning. The false Isolde's name was never spoken again. It was as if she had been a collective dream from which they had all, blessedly, awakened. It was Lorien who stepped into the vacuum. With Elara as his silent, unseen partner, he began the slow, arduous process of repairing the kingdom. He convened the old councils that Cation had neglected, reopened diplomatic channels that had been sealed for a century, and began redirecting the court's vast resources away from indulgent monuments and toward practical matters, reinforcing the borders, replenishing the armories, tending to the needs of the outer provinces. Elara remained in the library, but her role had fundamentally changed. She was no longer a prisoner or even a guest. She was the hidden fulcrum around which the new court turned. Lorien would come to her every night, not as a general addressing a subordinate, but as a colleague consulting an expert. They would sit among the ancient texts, and she, with her scholar's mind and outsider's perspective, would offer insights that his soldier's pragmatism might have missed. She drafted new trade agreements, citing precedents from long-dead empires. She proposed revisions to the legal code, arguing for clarity and justice over archaic tradition. She was building a new world from the bones of the old one, not with a sword, but with a pen. Her power was not in a title or a crown, but in the respect she had earned. Vampires who had once looked through her now sought her counsel, sent to the library by Lorien. They came to her with suspicion, but they left with a grudging admiration. She spoke their history back to them, showed them the forgotten strengths and ideals of their own people, and offered them a path forward that was not mired in the past. One evening, nearly a year after Isolde's disappearance, Caitian appeared at the library doors. He was much changed. The fine silks and jewels were gone, replaced by simple, unadorned black robes. His face was still pale and beautiful, but the terrible emptiness in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, somber contemplation. He looked less like a king and more like a penitent monk. Ilara did not stand. She simply watched him as he approached. "They are calling it the Scholar's Reformation," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of its former arrogance. "They say a human has taught us how to be vampires again." "I taught you nothing," Ilara replied. "I only reminded you of what you chose to forget." He nodded, accepting the truth of it. "Lorien tells me you wish to leave." It was true. For weeks, she had felt a growing restlessness. Her work here was done. The court was stabilizing, finding its new equilibrium. She had dismantled the broken system, and now others were building a better one in its place. She had risen, not to a throne, but to a place of self-possession and purpose. She was no longer a victim, no longer an object. It was time to go home. "My kingdom has paid its price for peace," she said. "I have served my term." "You have done more than that," Caitian said. He looked at her, his twilight eyes holding a profound and weary respect. "You held a mirror up to a monster and did not flinch. You saved my kingdom from its king." He paused, a flicker of the old pain crossing his features. "I cannot undo what I did. To you. To her. To everyone." The kneeling, it was an act of inexcusable cruelty. An attempt to break your spirit so I would not have to face the weakness in my own. "I know," Ilara said. "I have reopened the summer wing," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "Her tomb. I have had it brought to the royal crypts. She is buried now under her own name. Isolde of NYX. The histories are being rewritten. The true ones." He looked at Ilara, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of the man he might have been, the man Isolde might have loved before pride and jealousy consumed him. "It is a small thing. An insignificant penance. But it is a beginning. All reformations begin with a single, honest act," Ilara said, echoing a phrase she had read in one of the books. He gave a small, sad smile. Indeed, he reached into his robe and placed a small, velvet-wrapped object on the table. A parting gift. Not a payment. A token of gratitude. He turned and left without another word. Ilara unwrapped the object. It was a key. Old, iron, and intricately wrought. She recognized it instantly from a drawing in the architectural survey. It was the master key to the great library. A key that legend said only the king himself possessed. It was a symbolic abdication, a passing of the torch. He was giving her the heart of his kingdom, and with it, the freedom to leave it behind. 2 days later, Ilara stood at the great gates of the Obsidian Palace. An honor guard, commanded by Lorien himself, stood at attention. It was not the escort of a departing prisoner, but of a visiting dignitary. A carriage laden with books of her own choosing stood waiting, along with chests of gold and silks, a dowry from the vampire court to the human lands, a formal sign of a new and balanced alliance. She looked back at the dark, volcanic spires of the palace. It had been her prison, her battlefield, and her university. She had arrived as a sacrificial lamb, an object to be used and discarded. She was leaving as the architect of a new era. She had not seized a throne or claimed a crown. Her victory was quieter, more profound. She had forced a stagnant, grieving world to face the truth, and in doing so, had freed not only herself, but them as well. Lorien stepped forward, his grim face holding a rare expression of warmth. "The sunken kingdoms will be glad to have their duchess back," he said. Ilara smiled. "I am more than a duchess now." She had been made to kneel, a pawn in a mad king's tragic fantasy. But from that lowly place, she had seen the truth. She had learned, she had planned, and she had risen. Not by stepping on the bodies of her enemies, but by helping them find their own way out of the darkness. She got into the carriage, the iron key a cool, solid weight in her pocket. As the carriage pulled away, she did not look back. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the future she had built for herself, one word, one truth, one quiet act of courage at a time. She had risen above them both, and in doing so, had found herself.